Transvestigation has been in the news a lot lately. For those unfamiliar with the term, it refers to the practice of scrutinizing people's appearances for supposed telltale signs that they are transgender. There are hardcore transvestigators who spend much of their time poring over pictures of celebrities, with some believing that large swaths of Hollywood are secretly trans. Several articles and YouTube videos have chronicled online communities that are dedicated to this endeavor. Then there's the recent gender-critical and conservative meltdown over Olympic boxer Iman Khalif, who, despite being born and raised female, and verified by the International Olympic Committee, was mercilessly attacked online by J.K. Rowling, Elon Musk, and the entire Fox News cinematic universe for supposedly being a man. That is to say, these people presumed that Khalif was a trans woman. The Boston Globe even ran a headline to this effect, despite the fact that there weren't any trans women competing at this year's Olympics. Most accounts of transvestigation that I've come across either portray the phenomenon as a bizarre conspiracy theory, or the inevitable byproduct of transphobic brain rot. That is, individuals who've become so consumed with transphobia that they've lost their grip on reality, or some combination thereof. While these things may certainly be true, this framing seems to imply that the rest of us see gender and trans people normally or correctly. And frankly, nothing could be further from the truth. In reality, as individuals, we often see and interpret gender in wildly different ways. I have written at great length about how we perceive sex and gender in my most recent book, Sexed Up. And I explored the many obstacles these ways of seeing create for trans and other gender non-conforming people in my first book, Whipping Girl. In this essay, I will draw on some of those ideas to explain what transvestigation really is and why it happens, but also to explore more mundane, yet nevertheless fucked up ways in which we perceive and interpret gender and sexual minorities. Part 1. The Two Filing Cabinets Mindset. In the introduction to her decidedly anti-trans book, Trans, gender-critical activist Helen Joyce claimed that, quote, "Since evolution has equipped humans with the ability to recognize other people's sex almost instantaneously and with exquisite accuracy, very few trans people pass as their desired sex." End quote. In a now-deleted tweet speculating that Iman Khalif must be intersex, columnist Megan McArdle similarly claimed that, quote, "People are shockingly good at visually distinguishing males from females, even when you choose relatively androgynous models, and even when you strip visual cues like hair." End quote. This assumption that sexing or gendering, that is, categorizing other people as male or female, is a finely honed human skill of near-perfect precision is a cisgender delusion. As I put it in Sexed Up, for most of us, this confidence probably stems in part from their own experiences with being correctly gendered by other people on a regular basis. After all, if you identify as a man, and everyone you come across correctly presumes that you're a man, then that might leave you with the impression that gender categorization is a straightforward and foolproof process. I go on to say, in contrast, those of us who happen to be transgender or gender nonconforming often have very different experiences, being perceived as both female and male at different points in our lives, or, in some cases, within the same minute, that may shed light onto how we, all of us, see gender. In Chapter 1 of Sexed Up, The Two Filing Cabinets in Our Minds, I provide an overview of this process. I begin by describing the large body of psychological and sociological research into how young children come to understand gender. After all, we don't come out of the womb seeing women and men. It's a learning process. It's usually around the ages of 1 or 2 that children become consciously aware that some people are boys and other people are girls. This has been called the gender identity or gender labeling stage. Yet even after understanding that distinction, young children rely on very different cues than adults, largely based on gender presentation, such as clothing and hair length, rather than physical traits, which adults tend to rely on. They also have a more flexible and fluid view of it. For instance, if you show young children a photo of a boy, then a second photo of the same boy in a dress, they will often presume that the boy's gender has changed. It's not until ages 4 to 7 that children learn gender constancy, the belief that a person's sex will remain the same over the course of their life. Researchers back in the 1960s and 1970s imagined gender constancy to be the most sophisticated stage. Although from a trans perspective today, it seems more like an overgeneralization or faulty assumption that children in our society learn. The rest of the chapter discusses my personal experiences transitioning. Specifically, when I was at my most in-between stage, several months after being on hormones, rather than being in a gender limbo where nobody knew what to make of me, people almost always read me as either male or female. It's just that I couldn't predict which one. It wasn't unusual for two individuals in the same room to come to differing conclusions. And once a person made that determination, they invariably acted surprised or skeptical if I told them that I was actually the other gender. This happened in both directions. In other words, once we categorize someone one way or the other, we tend to filter away any gender-ambiguous or conflicting cues. This filtering process has also been described by sociologists who've studied the issue. Anyway, based on these and other experiences, I make the case that it's as if we have two metaphorical filing cabinets in our minds, one for male and one for female, in which we unconsciously file people into immediately upon seeing them, and which makes it difficult for people to contemplate trans and intersex people, especially those who are non-binary. Once again, this is all learned behavior, and thus not written in stone. Some cultures have what are sometimes referred to as third genders, outside of male and female, so it's quite likely that they learn to gender people in a somewhat different manner. It's also possible to gradually unlearn this two-filing cabinets mindset. For instance, upon becoming more familiar with gender and sexual minorities and communities. I will return to this point a bit later. Gender-critical activists like Joyce will often insist that biological sex is strictly dichotomous and immutable. When they do this, what they're actually asserting is the fact that they perceive the world that way. It appears strictly dichotomous to them because of the two-filing cabinets mindset, and they presume it to be immutable because they've internalized gender constancy. And because the act of perceiving sex involves filtering away any gender-ambiguous or conflicting cues, many people literally cannot see, and therefore are thus reluctant to believe, any evidence to the contrary. Part 2. Ungendering and the Look. The combination of the two filing cabinets mindset, relentlessly sorting everyone we see into either female or male categories, and gender constancy, a belief that people's sex cannot change, leads to cis assumption. That is, we presume that every person we meet is cisgender, or cissexual by default. We often talk about trans people being closeted or coming out as trans, or we discuss them passing as cisgender or being read or clocked as transgender. None of these concepts would exist if we didn't first assume that every person we meet must be cis. In Whipping Girl Chapter 8, Dismantling Cissexual Privilege, where I first wrote about cis assumption and the unconscious process of gendering other people, I also introduced the term ungendering. Quote, "When we presume a person to be cissexual, we generally accept their overall perceived gender as natural and authentic, while disregarding any minor discrepancies in their gender appearance. However, upon discovering or suspecting that a person is transsexual, we often actively, and rather compulsively, search for evidence of their assigned sex in their personality, expressions, and physical bodies. I've experienced this firsthand during the countless occasions when I've come out to people as transsexual. Upon learning of my trans status, most people get this distinctive look in their eye, as if they're suddenly seeing me differently, searching for clues of the boy that I used to be, and projecting different meanings onto my body. I call this process ungendering, as it is an attempt to undo a trans person's gender by privileging incongruities and discrepancies in their gendered appearance that would normally be overlooked or dismissed if they were presumed to be cissexual. End quote. I also describe several instances of the look in Sexed Up. Sometimes it would occur when people initially read me as female, as I was taking estrogen at the time, but then discovered that I was male, either because I was still going by my old name and/or other people referred to me as he, him. Other instances of the look took place when I came out as trans to people who had previously known me as male, most of whom hadn't even noticed the feminine changes in my appearance up to that point, likely because they were filtering out those inconsistencies. A third variation happened when people who knew me as male didn't even recognize me after my transition because they initially gendered me as female upon seeing me. It was only after I told them who I was that they gave me the look. If I had to define the look, I would describe it as a conscious reappraisal and sometimes recategorization of a person's sex or gender. Because it's a conscious process, it usually takes a few awkward seconds, unlike the unconscious snap judgments of gendering people. While I have found it uncomfortable to be subjected to the look, I don't think it's an inherently bad thing. For instance, some of the people who gave me the look in the aforementioned situations were refiling me from the male to female filing cabinets in their minds. But where the look most definitely sucks is when people use it to ungender you. That is what I described in the aforementioned passage of Whipping Girl, where individuals who previously viewed me as uncomplicatedly female suddenly scrutinized my body for any real or imagined signs of maleness. To be clear, not everybody does this upon learning that I'm trans, but some do. So why do people resort to ungendering trans people like this? Well, if you strongly adhere to gender constancy, or gender essentialism, then you might insist that my real sex is male, and attempt to excavate it from the supposed facade of my femaleness. To be clear, this is not how transitioning works. Estrogen has physically changed my body in all sorts of ways. But essentialists do tend to imagine trans people as having real sex interiors that are obscured by false sex exteriors. On top of this, knowing that I understand myself as female, a gender essentialist might intentionally harp on my real or imagined male sex characteristics as a way of invalidating my gender identity. In other words, ungendering is often an explicitly anti-trans ideological endeavor. But sometimes people who are not explicitly or ideologically anti-trans will ungender us for other reasons. In Chapter 9 of Whipping Girl, Ungendering in Art and Academia, I discussed this tactic of ungendering trans and intersex subjects in order to evoke emotions in audiences, and or to make some broader point. Here is a pertinent passage from that chapter, in which I react to philosopher Michel Foucault's writings on Herculine Barbin, who was intersex, and sociologist Harold Garfinkel's writings on Agnes, who was trans. Quote, "The fact that both Foucault and Garfinkel claim to be making larger points about gender in society, Foucault, that society imposes a true sex on all its members, Garfinkel, that we all actively manage and produce our gendered sense of self, makes their subject choice seem rather dubious. Wouldn't their cases have been stronger if they'd focus instead on subjects who were not gender variant, who were not such obvious exceptions to the rule? I would argue that Herculine and Agnes were chosen as subjects not because their conditions offered any unique insights into social gender, but because their gender variant status facilitated their depiction as specimens. After all, one only has to look at how apologetic people become when they accidentally misgender another person, or how insulting it is generally considered to be to suggest that someone's femaleness or maleness is suspect in any way, to understand that ungendering is an inherently demeaning process. If Foucault and Garfinkel had instead chosen to pick apart the gender identities of young people who were not gender variant, the process of ungendering would have undoubtedly, and appropriately, seemed intrusive and disrespectful. But because society typically views transsexual and intersex people as illegitimate and unnatural, even inhuman, Agnes and Herculine could be depicted as mere objects of inquiry, without any chance of the audience identifying with them or sympathizing with them." End quote. In other words, the act of ungendering is intuitively understood to be invasive and demeaning when applied to cis people, but deemed warranted or justified when trans and intersex people are subjected to it. With this information in hand, we can now define transvestigation, the act of ungendering a cis person under the rationale that they are really or secretly trans. In support of this definition, online transvestigator communities will sometimes have rules against transvestigating people who aren't famous, which seem designed to prevent them from ungendering one another. And some members will even post evidence proving that they are cisgender. See, for example, this video 11 to 13 minutes in. In other words, they seem to understand that transvestigation is inherently invalidating and disparaging, and should only be conducted on people who supposedly deserve it. Read trans people. This also explains many trans people's ambivalent feelings regarding the whole Iman Khalif ordeal. Speaking for myself, I thought what happened to her was horrific. I could very much relate to it as someone who experiences very similar ungendering and transphobic harassment on a regular basis. But at the same time, I was extremely frustrated by the many cis commentators who seemed to go out of their way to say that what Khalif experienced was cruel and unfair because she was born female and raised as a girl. Once again, this seems to suggest these commentators would be okay with said ungendering and harassment if it was directed at the proper targets. For example, someone like me. This is why I entreat all of you to ditch the word transvestigation, as it's rooted in the fucked up notion that it's justified to ungender trans people, but not cis people. Instead, let's simply call it what it is: ungendering. And admit that it's invasive and demeaning to do it to anyone. Part 3. Delusions of Gaydar and Transdar. So now we know what transvestigation is, but we still need to explain why it happens. Specifically, why does it target people who most of us would agree are clearly cisgender? And why do the individuals who engage in this practice seem to do so rather compulsively? To address these latter issues, we need to talk about one of my least favorite topics, Transdar, which is analogous to Gaydar, which I also hate. Since most people are more familiar with Gaydar, I will start there. Gaydar is the supposed ability to determine whether an individual is gay or not by simply observing them. In my experience, it is usually espoused by people who have some, but not extensive, familiarity with LGB communities. And more often than not, the imagined signs of gayness is gender expression, whether a person's mannerisms, dress, behaviors, and interests are masculine and/or feminine. The problem is that it's well documented that sexual orientation and gender expression are separable traits that do not always align within the same person. For example, some lesbians are feminine, some gay men masculine, and many LGB people come across as quite average or unremarkable in their gender expressions. In Sexed Up, I cite several studies that show that Gaydar is merely an assumption rather than a verifiable skill. See Chapter 8, Notes 13 through 15. I want to highlight one of those studies here. Mitchell and Ellis, 2011. In the Eye of the Beholder, knowledge that a man is gay promotes American college students' attributions of cross-gender characteristics. Basically, they found that if you tell observers that a man is gay, then they will rate him as being less masculine and more feminine than observers who are not given this information. This is further evidence that we are not purely objective observers who see the world for what it is. Rather, what we believe to be true influences how we see other people. And there's a self-reinforcing aspect to this, where if we know or believe or suspect that someone is queer, then they will look even more queer to us. And this is just as true for imagined Transdar as it is for Gaydar. There was a time in my early 20s when I felt like I had developed a sense of Transdar. I had done a ton of pre-internet research on trans people in order to make sense of my own predicament. This included seeing lots of pictures and a couple documentaries about trans folks. And after having done this, sometimes I'd be walking down the street and I'd see someone and think to myself, I'm pretty sure that person is trans. Sometimes my hunches turned out to be correct. I remember when The Crying Game first came out in the early 1990s, and everyone kept talking about there being a big plot twist in the movie. Upon seeing a TV commercial for the film, I immediately read the character Dill as trans. And I further assumed, not unlike Helen Joyce, that everyone else must plainly see what I was seeing. So I honestly went into the movie assuming that there must be some other non-trans related plot twist. I realized that I was wrong about midway through the film, during the now infamous scene where Dill disrobes, and the rest of the audience gasped in shock. Which in turn shocked me. I mean, seriously, she performed the Torch song in what was obviously a queer bar earlier in the movie. Didn't any of you see that? As I said, we don't always see the same thing with regards to gender and sexuality. So anyway, my supposed Transdar seemed to work in that case. And sometimes in real life, I'll meet a person who strikes me as trans, and it will turn out that they're actually trans. But there have also been times where I assumed that someone was trans, but it turned out they weren't. And still other times when I presumed that someone was cis, but they turned out to be trans. I even had a few experiences back in the day when other trans people didn't believe me at first when I said that I was trans, likely because I'm quite short for someone who has experienced a male puberty. The more time I've spent in trans and queer communities, the more obvious it is to me that we simply cannot predict another person's sexual orientation, gender identity, or personal history simply by looking at them. This is part of the rationale behind the relatively recent custom of sharing pronouns. Cis people who presume that they can gender other people with exquisite accuracy tend to view pronouns in email signatures or conference badges as trans people pushing our beliefs, so-called gender ideology, onto other people. But frankly, it's quite the opposite. It comes from a place of understanding what we do not know. It comes from recognizing that we cannot trust our own assumptions when it comes to gendering other people. Having had first-hand experiences of being gendered in disparate ways by different people, we know full well that you cannot always tell whether someone is a woman or man, or whether they're cis or trans. This is especially true for non-binary people, who are often not seen at all. You can only know for sure if they tell you. Part 4. Dismantling the two filing cabinets mindset, for better or worse. While Transdar is fallible and unreliable, allow me to put a more positive spin on the phenomenon. It represents an intermediate step between the naivete of cis assumption, presuming that every person you meet is cis by default, and the more nuanced view I just espoused, that we cannot always accurately determine other people's genders. In discussing the two filing cabinets mindset earlier, I emphasized that it involves filtering away any gender ambiguous or conflicting cues. I'd argue that what Transdar is, or at least what it entails, is noticing or picking up on those same cues and taking them into consideration rather than discounting them. While I've been calling these cues gender ambiguous, most of them actually represent similarities or natural overlap between female and male sex characteristics. I delve into this in great length in the Sex is Multifaceted and Sex is Variable sections of my Trans People and Biological Sex, What the Science Says video. Here, I will briefly touch on 3 main points. 1. Biological sex is not a simple or singular entity, but rather a collection of sex characteristics or traits. 2. Most human traits are complex traits that arise through the interactions of many factors, and thus give rise to bell curve-shaped spectrums, where most individuals are clustered around some average outcome, but there will always be outliers who differ from the norm. 3. With regards to sex characteristics, or sexually dimorphic traits as they are sometimes called, the result is overlapping bell curves. In some cases, such as primary sex characteristics such as chromosomes or genitals, there may be relatively little overlap between the sexes. But for others, especially secondary sex characteristics that arise in response to hormones during puberty, there may be significant overlap between the sexes. We are all familiar with this human variation and overlap between the sexes. For instance, while men on average tend to be taller than women, all of us know tall women and short men. And while men tend to have more pronounced body hair than women, we all know relatively hairless men and hairy women. Furthermore, it is not unusual to come across short men who are quite hairy, or tall women who are fairly hairless, and so on. In other words, people are not fully male or fully female. Rather, each of us exhibits a wide array of sex characteristics for which we may be gender typical for some traits and gender atypical for others. So which of these traits do we rely on when gendering other people? Well, in everyday situations, we rely almost entirely on their secondary sex characteristics. That is, traits that often exhibit large overlap between the sexes. And to a lesser degree, their gender expression, their clothing, mannerisms, etc. Crucially, we do not rely on any singular trait while gendering other people. As I put it in Sexed Up, drawing from sociological studies on gender perception, when we categorize people according to gender, we do not rely on any singular cue. Rather, our assessment is based on our overall impression of the person. Or, as some of my statistics-inclined friends might say, gender perception is in the aggregate. In addition to that, the relevance of any given trait may vary significantly depending upon the circumstances. Quote, all gender cues are contextual, both with regards to perceiving an individual in isolation and assessing a large group of people. For example, at a prom, where all the women are wearing gowns and the men tuxedos, clothing becomes a highly relevant gender marker. But this would not be particularly true at a goth concert, where most people, regardless of gender, are dressed in black with elaborate hairstyles and makeup. There, we might rely more heavily on other cues. End quote. Knowing all this, we can finally understand Transdar as an intermediate step. Back in my early 20s, when I surmised that Dill from the Crying Game was a trans character, I also found myself paying more attention to gender atypical traits in virtually everyone. For instance, I remember noticing how female news anchors tend to have somewhat deeper voices or more pronounced jawlines than the average woman. I presumed that this was due to sexist presumptions about what comes across as authoritative. To be clear, I never once thought these women were secretly trans. And I wouldn't describe what I was doing as ungendering them. After all, I never questioned whether or not they were really women. I was simply beginning to truly see and appreciate the natural variation in sex characteristics that human beings exhibit. Rather than continuing to call this Transdar, a more productive way of thinking about it is that I was beginning to dismantle the two filing cabinets mindset that had previously shaped how I perceived gender. I began noticing atypical sex characteristics more often, but I didn't presume that they signified anything in particular. Over time, I began to see most people as potentially cis, but also potentially trans. Insert Schrodinger's joke here. Recognizing all this ultimately helped me to realize that transitioning was a possibility for me. Back when the two filing cabinets mindset shaped my perceptions, it seemed as though there was an insurmountable chasm separating female from male, one that I could never hope to cross. But once I learned to appreciate the many similarities and overlaps between the sexes, I realized that while my voice is deeper than the average woman, I've met cis women with even deeper voices. And while some of my other features may be more masculine than I'd prefer, I learned that other people will tend to overlook them if enough other cues strike them as feminine. While this isn't every trans person's experience, a lot of us come to understand firsthand that gender perception involves overall impressions and is highly contextual, which is why it can be so frustrating to discuss this subject with trans unaware cis people. Many of them see gender as strictly black or white due to their unquestioned two filing cabinets mindset, which makes it extremely difficult to convey the nuance and complexity that we've personally experienced. But of course, with increasing trans visibility in our culture, many cis people are becoming more familiar with our existence. And upon repeated exposure to trans people, they too may begin to dismantle the two filing cabinets mindset, but in a bad way. Or perhaps I should say, some of them seem to learn the wrong lessons from it. I was struck by this Twitter exchange a few years back. Katie Herzog says, "This is maybe the sort of thing I should tell my therapist, dog, instead of Twitter, but one effect of the boom in trans population is that when I see a large woman or a petite man, I assume they are trans. I have tried to prevent my brain from doing this, but no, it won't stop." A commenter responds, "Same, I find myself checking out people's hands." Herzog replies, "I tell my brain to stop, but it's like hands, and eyes, and voices." This exchange was widely shared on trans Twitter at the time because 1. Herzog has written and podcasted about trans issues in a manner that many, including me, have found biased against trans perspectives, and 2. People found it hilarious that she mentioned eyes here, as they are not significantly sexually dimorphic. I've never once heard of an actual trans person being clocked because of their eyes. These tweets are from 2021, which was before the online Transvestigator phenomenon started garnering attention. And to be clear, I am not insinuating that Herzog is a so-called transvestigator. But this does seem to be an example of dismantling the two filing cabinets mindset in a bad way. Rather than appreciating that people, whether woman or man, cis or trans, come in various shapes and forms, Herzog says that when she sees people who are gender atypical with regards to size and possibly other traits, she will, quote-unquote, assume they are trans. It's been several years since that post, so hopefully she's in a better place now. Like I said, imagine Transdar is often an intermediate step. But some people do seem to get stuck in this phase. And I'd argue that this is what is driving the phenomenon of so-called transvestigation. People who have some, but not extensive, familiarity with trans people, who develop an overactive or compulsive transdar that could readily be resolved if they simply recognize the vastness of human gender and sexual diversity, rather than dwelling on the existence of real or imagined trans people. Part 5. Believing is seeing. I began this essay the way that many recent accounts of this issue have, namely by citing online transvestigators who believe that most celebrities in Hollywood have been gender swapped, along with prominent anti-trans activists who insist that Iman Khalif is really a man, and presenting them as though they are all part of the same phenomenon. While both groups do appear to be stuck in the overactive transdar phase I just described, they nevertheless perceive gender very differently from one another, and often come to wildly different conclusions. For example, I cannot possibly imagine J.K. Rowling, given her past history, arguing that Henry Cavill or Ryan Gosling, famous cis-male actors, as well as Dylan Mulvaney and Caitlyn Jenner, famous trans women, were all born female. Yet these are all claims that the online transvestigator community has made. So what is going on here? Well, earlier I mentioned the Mitchell and Ellis Gaydar study, where observers rated men as more feminine if they are told that he is gay beforehand. In other words, to some extent, people see what they expect to see. And this is also true for gendering. Back when I first started presenting as female in public, prior to transitioning, I preferred to go to mundane settings, such as suburban malls, because nobody would ever pay any attention to me there. I wasn't read as trans in those spaces, largely because nobody expected to see any trans people there. But nowadays, despite having transitioned, if I attend a trans conference or event, I know that lots of people will immediately pick up on the fact that I'm trans. And it's not necessarily because people in those spaces have advanced Transdar. Rather, it's because they are expecting to see trans people in those settings. So they are primed for it when it happens. In fact, I've heard multiple stories about cis partners being read as trans themselves at such events. Not because their appearance was especially gender ambiguous or atypical, but because people in those spaces were expecting to see trans people. So what are transvestigators expecting to see? Well, in the case of online groups that focus on celebrities, many of them apparently believe in elite gender inversion, a conspiracy theory that, according to Teen Vogue, quote, essentially holds that every famous person is secretly trans, part of a cabal who are transgender as part of a ritualistic initiation of some kind, end quote. Since these individuals have been primed to believe that every celebrity is secretly trans, they will, consciously or unconsciously, seek out any and all cues via ungendering that confirm that prior. This is what allows them to perceive Ryan Gosling as secretly female and Farrah Fawcett as secretly male due to the shape of their clavicles, while filtering out the rest of their bodies, as well as their well-established cisgender life histories. And even if Fawcett and Gosling had gender-typical clavicles, these conspiracy theorists would inevitably find some other supposedly gender-atypical trait, their pelvis, jawline, height, eyes, or what have you, because in their mind, these celebrities are transgender a priori. And yes, this will strike most of us as ridiculous. But then again, is assuming that all celebrities are trans and filtering away any evidence that they are cis fundamentally different from assuming that all celebrities are cis and filtering away any evidence that they are trans, a la the two filing cabinets mindset? In stark contrast, gender-critical activists and many conservative pundits subscribe to a very different narrative. They believe transgender is simply a ploy to allow male misogynists and sexual predators to infiltrate women's spaces in order to harm women and/or groom children. This, too, is a conspiracy theory. See these essays for more on that. And this narrative primes its believers to be on the constant lookout for trans female and feminine people, the supposed male predators/infiltrators, while disregarding trans male and masculine people, who they imagine as merely young girls who have been seduced by the transgender agenda. This narrative creates humongous blind spots in their gender perception, such that if you show gender-critical activists photos of the trans boy who was forced to wrestle girls because his league refused to recognize his gender identity, or a bearded trans man in a women's restroom making a point about what anti-trans bathroom bills would entail, they will often compulsively interpret those individuals as trans women invading women's spaces, because that is the distorted lens through which they see gender. In Matt Bernstein's YouTube video, Transvestigating, with ContraPoints, around the 30 to 33 minute mark, the two of them discuss a recurring social media joke. If a gender-critical activist is ranting about trans women, sometimes people will show them a picture of J.K. Rowling or some other cis woman and ask them, "So do you really think this is a man?" And many times, the gender-critical activists will retort, "Yes, that is definitely a man." It's funny in a way, because it undermines their assertion that they can always tell when someone is trans. And in the case of Rowling, who relentlessly ungenders trans women on Twitter, it gives her a taste of her own medicine. But this tendency can also be quite scary, as we saw with the Iman Khalif ordeal. While I was appalled by what happened, I was not at all surprised. For many years now, gender-critical activists and conservative pundits have been whipping up a moral panic about trans people in women's sports and trans predators in women's restrooms. They have primed their audiences to perceive anyone who is gender ambiguous or gender atypical in any way as a trans woman. Read, a man who is infiltrating women's spaces with the intent to harm. All the fact-checking in the world won't change their perception. Indeed, Rawling is still tweeting about Khalif several weeks later. It's nearly impossible to unsee something if you are deeply committed to believing it. Part 6. Other Perceptual Biases. Or, why trans women, gender non-conforming women, and women of color are especially fucked. It should be clear by now that there isn't any singular or correct way to perceive sex and gender. Instead, there's merely a host of different mindsets and narratives and cues that may influence us one way or another. In this final section, I want to quickly mention a few other perceptual biases that also seem to be playing a role here. In my writings on gender perception, I often quote Suzanne Kessler and Wendy McKenna's seminal book, Gender, an Ethnomethodological Approach. This summary of one of their studies appeared in my book Outspoken. They showed participants a series of drawings of people who had a mix of typically male and female attributes. Short or long hair, flat chests or breasts, narrow or wide hips, body hair or not, and of course, either male or female genitals. They found that male cues always tended to trump female cues. In other words, figures with a mix of masculine and feminine attributes tended to be read as men rather than women. This disparity was particularly acute for genitals. If the figure with mixed gender attributes had a vagina, people only saw it as female 64% of the time. In other words, 36% of the time, other male cues trumped the presence of a vagina. The reverse was not true. If the figure had a penis, it was read as male 96% of the time, often even when all other gender attributes were feminine. Kessler and McKenna attributed this tendency to societal-wide male-centrism, not unlike how people often use the pronoun he when speaking generically. Whatever the reason, this tendency likely leads people to read trans women as trans more frequently than trans men. But it also makes gender nonconforming cis women especially susceptible to ungendering, as simply having one or more masculine-coded attributes, such as being tall or having short hair, may result in others misperceiving them as trans and/or men. Here is another perceptual bias that I discuss in Sexed Up. Several studies have shown that white U.S. subjects tend to stereotype women of color, especially black women, as being more masculine than white women. On top of this, there is a long history of 19th century sexologists and other purveyors of scientific racism claiming that white people, especially Northern Europeans, exhibit the highest levels of sex differences between women and men. The implication being that non-white ethnicities are inherently more gender ambiguous. While not supported by contemporary science, these perceptual fictions continue to persist in the white imagination in many Western countries, and have almost certainly influenced the recent Iman Khalif ordeal, past debates over black athletes like Caster Semenya, and the relentless right-wing conspiracy theories purporting that Michelle Obama is secretly trans. Finally, throughout Sexed Up, I examined the myriad ways in which marginalized groups, especially people of color and LGBTQ+ people, are routinely misperceived as excessively sexual relative to the dominant majority group, in this case, white and straight people. This almost certainly informs the aforementioned gender-critical and conservative stereotypes of trans people as sexual predators and groomers. Since writing Sexed Up, I've penned 2 online essays that further investigate this tendency. Anti-trans grooming and social contagion claims explained, and penises, privilege, and feminist and LGBTQ+ purity politics. Conclusion. Nearly everybody assumes that they see the world normally and objectively, as it really is. It is my hope that this essay has disabused you of this fallacy. I have stressed the importance of recognizing the panoply of human gender and sexual diversity, and how this has personally helped me to realize that transitioning was a possibility for me. But there is one other crucial piece to that puzzle. I also had to transcend anti-trans stigma. It took some time, but I eventually overcame all those twisted yet pervasive notions that trans people are gross, or weird, or defective, or mutilated, or abominations, or predators, and so forth. These too are perceptual fictions that we should strive to abandon. I can assure you that if you refuse to relinquish these stigmatizing notions, then you will perpetually ascribe far more salience to transness than it deserves. In all honesty, trans people are rather mundane. Not in the sense that we're boring, but in the sense that we are everywhere. According to current statistics, we make up about 0.7% of the US population, which doesn't sound like a lot, granted. But there are more trans people in the United States than there are plumbers, or people who live in Delaware. According to Pew Research, 42% of Americans today say they know someone who is trans. Seriously, there's no reason why anyone should be making a big deal about our existence nowadays. Today, in 2024, if you find yourself fixating on trans people, or feel concerned because you suddenly see us everywhere, please consider the possibility that this is a you problem. Not everybody sees the world that way, and it is definitely possible for you to transcend your current predicament. I sincerely hope that this essay provides you some help in seeing your way through it.